What's up, Warriors, and welcome to another episode of the Mental Health Movement Podcast, Voice for the Voiceless. I am your host, Chris. Thank you guys again for your support these last couple weeks as I ease my way back into both the mental health group and just the mental health community in general. Appreciate all your patience, appreciate all the emails and support that you guys have been giving me over these last couple weeks. Today's special guest, I was on his podcast, I want to say I think a few months ago now. Yeah, we recorded in June and told my story from the perspective of the questions he had asked. And, I wanted to have him on here and tell his story because he has quite the story to tell. So he is a U.S. Navy veteran. He's an author and a speaker, and he is also the host of the CoupleoNukes podcast. Please help me welcome Mr. Whiskey. How you doing,
Thank
my
you for
friend?
having me. Thank you for having me. And like you mentioned, you were on my show. Actually, one of my most popular episodes in terms of like instant takeoff. I think it's because your story touched upon so much homelessness, suicide, being a voice for the voiceless, and a story that just is very raw but very truthful. And you and I really got into parental and family bonds, which a lot more people relate to than they share up front. The millennial and downward generations, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, a lot of divorced homes, a lot of broken homes and stuff. So I think, you really spoke to a lot of people in that episode. And I appreciate you, returning the favor, so to speak, and having me on your show. It's great to be here.
Yeah, man, of course. And like we were talking about on your podcast, just like all the trials and tribulations I had to face growing up, and I know you can relate on a lot of those situations that I had faced. And I know you have quite the story to tell yourself. So, let's jump into it. Before you had the podcast, before a couple of nukes, right? Um, what was life like for you? What were the early chapters of your story?
For sure. So back before I was a nuke, I was just a little nukeling in the making. Home life was interesting. The story really goes back before I was even born, and I found all this out not until my later years when I was serving in the military, really, that after my mom and dad kind of started living separate and my father's alcoholism, got exponentially worse. That's when a lot of information was revealed from both sides to me about everything. And so just even going back to the night of my birth, both my parents disagree on how I was born, so that alone just shows you that they haven't been on the same page. My mom says that my dad wasn't there, that he was cheating on her with this mistress. My dad says that he was there, that he cut my umbilical cord with his own hands. My mom says, okay, he was there, but then he left. My dad says he stayed all night. That he did cheat, the nights before and after, but not the night of my birth. And all these different stories, and the stories around my birth on my father's end are, much crazier that the legions of Satan, wanted me to be the Antichrist, that they begged my father to name me Damien, and that he refused, almost did, but refused, that his mistress wanted to take me away and raise me as her own with my father, that she begged and pleaded, and my father refused because he said it was not good to take the child from his mother to the point that she offered $250,000 to raise me as her own and for my dad to leave my wife, and he refused. And then he said she eventually got tired of it and left. And ironically enough, because we're podcasters, ran off into the sunset with Joe Rogan. Who when he first told the story, I never knew who that was. Given their ages, it's maybe a possibly true story. I don't know. I just know my dad hates Joe Rogan because, quote, Joe Rogan stole this blonde mistress from me. I don't know if it's true or not. I'm gonna find out one day. That's one of my missions is to find out if that's true or not.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I'm ready for Joe Rogan to say I have no idea who this guy is, and I don't date blondes. I'm not ready for the yeah. I stole your dad's mistress. Oh, whoa. Okay, this is a whole new level of trauma and drama to add to my life. But so just from my birth alone, there was a lot going on. There was domestic violence on my parents' honeymoon before I was born, and then you know. my mom had stayed because of a lot of different reasons, and then I was born, siblings were born. Second sister, relatively normal, except my father's father died the same week she was born. And so they never really bonded properly because he was going through a lot. And then ironically enough, it had happened to, I believe, my grandfather in the same hospital on the same day. Nurses came from both ends, one to say that his brother had passed, the other to say that his grandkid had been born, you know. So talk about this strange moments in life. And it kind of happened to my father, where in that same week, father passed away and sister was born. And, you know, it was just insane. And strangely enough, my mother had gotten a private hospital room, and Jay-Z, apparently, according to my dad, I believe it was Jay-Z, rented out the entire hospital, privatized the entire thing so that whoever he was with at the time could have a private berth, except for the one private room that my dad had paid like 15 or $30,000 to have this private room for my mother. And I believe, quote, Angelina Jolie had given birth in that room as well. So, you know, I don't know why he would make that up, but you know, sister number two, strange birth story as well. Sister number three would be my mom's sixth kid, and I know she didn't want any more. And my dad said that you know, she wasn't planned, and then my mom, you know, said some stuff that maybe that sister was kind of forced into existence, so to speak, by my father, and my father says other stuff, you know. So sister number three, not, or well, sister number two, sibling number, or, you know, child number three. Strange story as well. So from the very beginning, there's been a lot of relationship issues between my parents, and then you fast forward to when they're raising us now, and there's never peace in the home. There's some good family vacations. There's some good family dinners, but there's a lot of family dinners that end in arguing, with screaming, with cursing. You know, one parent at the other, or one child and at the parent, right? There's always some kind of beef. Sometimes it's a sister versus a mom. Sometimes it's me versus my mom. Sometimes it's me versus my dad. Sometimes it's all of us versus our dad. You know, always family quarrels. And this is as my father is serving as a police officer for 25 years, and it fuels his alcoholism because of insomnia, because of rotating shift work, because of what he sees out there. And so that gets slowly worse and worse. And the peak of it all is freshman year of high school. My grandmother passes away at the same time he retires. So again, talking about another strange moment of one of the best days and worst days of your life. My
Wow.
father and his grandmother were, or my grandmother, his mother, they saw each other every single day. She lived 5 minutes down the road from us. I mean, that was the most important thing in the world to him was his mother. They had a honestly from you know outsider perspective an unhealthily close relationship. It was almost an obsessive relationship. And so that kind of just drove him mad when she passed away. You know, the idea, and I get it too. I haven't really experienced too many deaths of people close to me, but the idea of you know, not her. I thought she lived until she was 100. I thought she was, you know, she died in her 60s of colon cancer, which she had been warned about, you know, preventing, and then she refused to go back to the doctor, and then it took her life. And I remember my grandmother wanted to pass away. She told me, she said, you know, back when I was just a little whiskey junior, you know, she said, listen, grandson, my husband's been dead for 13 years almost. I have like almost, you know, 10, 15 grandkids. I've lived life. I'm ready to move on. And, you know, my family, her brother, my great uncle, forced her to take chemotherapy, wanted her to live, you know, selfishly on his own choice. And it made her last days terrible, and she still died anyway. And she was miserable, bedridden, lost hair, and it was not what she wanted. And you know, and that's a whole conversation on its own about stuff like that. But I remember my aunts, you know, I'm not close with them at all. They were going through her stuff while she was still alive. They stole the car that she had left for me. They went and grabbed the, you know, title for it and transferred it over to themselves. They were stealing her physical belongings while she was in the living room, bedridden and dying. And then they you know, after the funeral, there was so much drama and stuff with the houses, with all of that stuff, with the cost of the funerals. And it was actually my mom, the mother, daughter-in-law who had taken care of my grandmother, who took her to all the medical appointments, did everything for her. And meanwhile, here are her actual daughters just robbing her while she's still alive and dying. So, after that point, when my grandmother passed away, my father it just really drove him off the deep end. At the same time as retiring, which as a first responder, retirement is a extremely difficult milestone. You lose identity, you lose purpose, you lose power. And he didn't get into any new hobbies or routines or jobs really. And so it was really detrimental to him. And
Yeah.
so throughout high school, it just got worse and worse. And then when I went off into the military, I was kind of the buffer between my father and the women in my family, my sisters and my mom. And so with me gone, and because I would spend all my time with him, I would deal with his insanity more than anyone. That's when things really fell apart. And then when I was in the military, my half sister passed away, and my mother's ex husband came to drop off her ashes when my father wasn't around, and my father, who is a very jealous man, um, you know, my mother knew this very clearly. She knew it would set him off, but she said, "Hey, the ex-husband came by while you weren't here." Obviously, my father didn't like that, and if you knew what my mom's ex-husband did to her, I don't blame my dad for hating his guts, and that kind of was the day that everything fell apart. My mom comes home with my sister. Dad's drunk on the front porch. He's got that look in his eye, and she called the cops, had him removed from the property, got a temporary restraining order because, she was fearful. And then they started going to court from there. A lot of, as they call it, they say skeletons in the closets were brought out between both my father and my mother. He wasn't able to properly defend himself because he was so intoxicated. It got to the point, and I was trying to help him, but I was states away in the military, doing nuclear operation stuff. So I didn't always have my phone, and I couldn't go to court on his behalf. And at one point, he was nervous about the big final court case. I told him, you're sober enough, like just continue to not drink. If for all I care, drink afterward, but make it through this court case, please. His cousin, who is a criminal in and out of halfway homes and rehabs and jail, calls him and says, "Hey, man, you need to just drink a little bit of vodka to steady your nerves and have a good court case." Well, my dad drank more than a little vodka. He drank so much that he fell down, cracked his head open at the court case,
Oh
goes to the
no.
hospital, and I get a phone call from people. He has 20 times the lethal amount of alcohol to kill a human being in his blood. So I take emergency leave from my ship and I have to go take care of him. And he's laying there crying in my arms, begging me to kill him, trying to give me he's laying down sheets on the floor and says we're Italian, we don't make a mess, so when you kill me, it's easy to clean up. You know, he's begging me to take his life. He's talking about demons and naming them by their names and stuff. And when he was really into the drugs and alcohol, I mean the satanic horrors he spoke of were just really far out there. And here he is crying, head in my lap, begging me to take his life. I take him out to the store. Dad, what do you want to, trying to buy him food and stuff because he has no food in the house, nothing but liquor. And I'm like, Dad, they got Rocky Road ice cream. That's your favorite. He goes, I don't want ice cream. I want a Glock. And I want you to put it in my mouth and blow my brains out all over the store is what I want. Stuff that, no, I guess at the time I was 19 or 20. I was 20, maybe 21. Stuff that no, I was 20. You know, a young adult, not wanting to I mean, no kid, regardless of their age, should have to deal with a parent, talking like this to them and putting them in that situation. But it was a very emotionally hard place to be in. And, from that time to now, I'm still the only one my father has. I'm the only one who deals with him through all of it because, my sister's mom, I can understand my mom not forgiving him because there's a lot between them
Yeah, sure.
pre my birth and during that. But my sisters, I feel like my mom really biased them, especially my younger sister who was raised just by my mom for, all of high school essentially. But they've never been able to understand addiction properly and to look past it. I'm not saying addiction justifies all behavior.
Yeah. Right.
Um, and I actually am featured in a book about forgiveness, Book of Frequency Forgiveness, coming out later this year. And I decided to write about my relationship with my father because people always say, Mr. Whiskey, you only have forgiven your father because of your faith, because you're a man of God. And it's more than that. God doesn't force us to forgive people. He tells us it's a good thing to do, and here's why to do it. But at the end of the day, it's a human choice to forgive. And I talk about forgiving with boundaries, which for a long time I didn't have that. My father basically could do whatever he wanted with me. And my life was always in danger. I was always kept in cleanup, and all of this. And eventually I gave boundaries on my time, not his time, not enabling his addiction anymore. And it was rough at first, but we're still able to have a relationship. And I try to help him. People know that I work in addiction recovery, and my number one patient is my own father, and he's the only patient I seem not to be able to, get through to. So I'll pause there for a little reflection.
Yeah, man. There's a lot there that I specifically want to cover, and I just want to, express the saying sorry for your half sister and, just your other relatives that you lost. Because obviously, as we talked about, just losing anybody in general is tough, especially when you're dealing with what you were dealing with, right? Um, so I guess my first question to follow up on you sharing this was, how did you cope through like the most coherent parts of that journey? Like, you were dealing with your dad's addiction and the problems that your mom had with him and so on and so forth. And I guess while you were in the military, I know they kind of want you to be headstrong, right? How did you go about coping with just all the things that you had to endure? Like you mentioned boundaries, but that came over time. Was there anything that you did specifically that maybe our listeners could use that are currently going through a family member or somebody close to them that's battling addiction? What coping mechanisms did you use?
For sure. And to your point about grief, it's hard enough grieving and then to have all the drama on top of it. And people are so disrespectful when it comes to like a lot of families fall apart whenever like a grandparent passes. It just happens. Not always, but and it's always like it's such a I feel like a lot of people don't get a respectful death. And now plenty of people do, but like you said, trying to grieve and then you've got all this drama going on top of it. I feel really bad. And, I did feel really bad for my mother, even though her and I don't get along at all. Because, here's her half sister passing, and now you've got all this stuff with my father, and her complaint was that he never let her grieve, properly. And I get that. And I understand also that my father doesn't know what that looks like because he never grieved his mother properly. He still is grieving now, years later. Which again, do you ever stop grieving? To a degree, no, but I'm talking about this is an unhealthy amount of
Yeah,
he's still in like the denial phase almost,
right.
and you're supposed to move past that at some point. That being said, to the point as well about military life being headstrong, I would be working all day dealing with, toxic military leadership, a terrible life, a ship that is infamous for suicide and cover-ups and terrible work conditions. And then I'm getting into my Iraq and I'm on the phone with my father listening to this madness arguing about and this is as I was beginning my journey of faith. So now I'm able to fight back and we're having biblical wars, um, you know, and then I'm not getting to sleep. And then when I finally get off the phone with him, I can't sleep because now I'm just so upset and angry about this stuff. My mom's calling me on the other end with court stuff and inheritance stuff and her end. And for a long time, I was on my mother's side. Ultimately, she's the one who got rid of our relationship over an Xbox, which that'll be a later segment. And in I've had, as you mentioned on my show, I've had my own time of my mom just screaming at me. You don't even say a word back. It just comes at you. And you finally give your piece and it's just like, you know. So I didn't have any friends on the PlayStation listening, unfortunately. It was just me, God, and my mom, and we'll get into that later. But to your point about coping, as far as like I would say from when I was growing up, starting seventh, eighth grade toward high school. And then my senior year, the second half of my senior year was right when COVID started. So going on around March time of my senior year of high school, they say, hey, we're going to take a 2 week break and then come back. There's some kind of thing going on. Like, we didn't know at all. They kind of just
Right.
said there was a 2 week break. We didn't even know why. We would know. We said, oh, there's like a quarantine thing going on, and then boom, never came back. No prom, no graduation, no yearbook, nothing. Just boom, and then into boot camp. And so what I did, especially during that time, but even prior to, I would come home and when not forced to be with my family, I would just be in my room till 2 a.m. sometimes just writing, creating fictional characters and fictional works that embodied a lot of what was happening at home. Some published, some unpublished. And, that was just my way of coping was creating characters that were each a reflection of my life, people who represented who I wanted to be and optimism, people who were the embodiment of my fear of growing up at that time because my parents made growing up extremely scary. And at the same time, all I wanted was to be independent. It was kind
Yeah.
of ironic. People who were the hateful rage side of my depression, the sorrowful lethargic side of depression. And so I would just be writing poetry and fiction for hours locked up in my room because my social life, I didn't have one. My dad was a cop for 25 years in this rinky-dink piece of crap town that just people hated me because my father was a cop. The all cops are this, cops are pigs, this and that. So going to school, it wasn't like that right away. There were some people who hated me automatically because of who my father was. People I never even met before, and I didn't even know my father had dealt with. Um, which I don't really have empathy for them because most of them were punks or breaking the law. So I don't really care. My father did his job. You chose your part. But there were people that I tried to be friends with who were super welcoming to me when I transferred from private school to public school. And then my father was like, "You're not allowed to hang out with those people because I've dealt with their parents or them before." And so my friend list instantly shrunk, my enemy list instantly expanded, and it was all because of my parents and their input. I was barely allowed to ever leave the house. We didn't really go out for family stuff ever since my grandmother passed. So it was just our little dysfunctional family fighting every night, this and that. I'm seeing my parents' relationship is unhealthy and terrible. My relationship with my siblings was, uh, always in a tumultuous state as well because of that. Later on, when I was in the military and my siblings were home, we kept getting put in the middle against each other, which, parents shouldn't do, but they do. My mom always said, I'll never convince you kids to hate your father. Your relationship with him is independent. People always say that. None of my family talks to me because I have a relationship with my father. Because, quote, you're just going to tell him where we are in life or what we're doing, and we don't want him to know. Um, my one sister never wanted my father to know, so he's always wondering if she's in the Middle East, 'cause she was in the military, if she was in the Middle East, she was here or there. I don't even talk to either my sisters or my mom anymore. And it's because I have a relationship with my father. So the whole, you can have a relationship with your father, I don't mind. He's your father, I'm your mother. That was total BS. I always got put in the middle. Always. And especially once my parents had a restraining order between them, I mean, there was no choice but to be in the middle. And it's hard because your mom's saying stuff, and I agreed with most of it. My dad's saying stuff, I agree with most of it. Now, it's not my choice to make, really, but I'm in this weird middle position. Then you've got my mom won't talk to me, so she sends my youngest sister to talk to me on her behalf. Now we're fighting. The only time I ever had a big major blowout with my youngest sister was because of my mother.
Yeah.
And so it's just a shame to see siblings get put against each other because of the parents. And now that we're older, we're trying to repair that. But even still, my sisters have resentment because I have a relationship with my dad. I have resentment because I have a relationship with my mom. And so it really did just destroy the family forever.
Yeah.
And, I seem to be the only one in the family who works in forgiveness, who works in any of this,
Right.
and I'm not saying that to say I'm so high and mighty, but it's just I understand my mom and dad would never get back together. She just filed for divorce a few days ago, so that bridge is burnt. But, like to my grandmother's point the other day, we were on the phone. She's like, did your mom call you and tell you it's your grandfather's 80th birthday and that we should And I said, no. I said, and you know what? Me and my grandma were on the same page. Everyone get together. It's my grandfather's 80th birthday. That's a huge milestone. He was not happy about it at all. He was very angry about it. He does not accept his age. But I said, you know what? If my mom had said, hey, son, Mr. Whiskey, can you show up and just you, me, and your sister, we don't even have to talk, but let's make it about our grandfather. I would have done that. But she doesn't do that stuff. She doesn't call and say, hey, everyone get together. In fact, her and my one sister aren't even talking anymore because she's really put herself first. And I want to give context. I offered to buy my mom a home down here in Georgia when my dad and mom were fighting. I offered for her to come live with me, and to be away from New Jersey, be away from all the drama, from away from the past, and to move forward and have a new life. And she said, no, I don't want to be a burden on my children. I offered to get her a home here, and pay for her to live here and for her to get a nice job at one of the bakeries in downtown Savannah and live a peaceful life. I offered, and she said no. I offered to take her on a cruise, and she said, I just don't have the time, son. Meanwhile, she's taking off days at a time, going to see my younger sister, every single military graduation she had. She didn't go to a single one for me and my other sister. But my youngest sister, every single military graduation she went to, she would take off for days at a time to go to Virginia Beach and spend weekends or holidays with my younger sister. Never saw me and my other sister in the military. After her and my dad split, my mom and my youngest sister became best friends instead of mother and daughter. And she's just taking it in. But this has been historical, Chris. My entire life, my mom puts one out of the six of us, now excluding my half sister, one of us always gets put up on the pedestal for a couple months, maybe a year or two. Mom does everything with them. They're everything. And then boom, discards them, different rotation cycle. And a lot of us just eventually got sick of it once we were adults and we're like, look, if we're not going to be your kid all the time, we're certainly not going to, indulge in this behavior of being your kid for a couple months or years at a time.
One of the craziest takeaways, I want to talk about the end there before I jump into my other question. Um, I can relate so hard on the parents playing favorites or, just putting the siblings on a pedestal because being the oldest, I was always under the impression that I didn't exist, right? And I thought I was delusional forever, for at least 10, 15 years. It wasn't until in the last 2 years that I had ex friends of my mom's and my own grandparents telling me, no, you're not crazy at all. Your parents completely ignored you. And that validation finally, when I'm 33 now and I got that validation, I was 31, finally made me realize that I'm not batshit crazy. That I'm going to therapy and all the things that I feel and talk about are valid, right? And at the end of the day, we want that validation from people that mean something to us, right? We want people to give a shit about us. And for the longest time, it still kind of goes on to this day. My dad always, if he ever calls me, it's usually asking about my siblings. It's never asking how I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom doesn't have a relationship with any of us because she destroyed that on her own. And before it was destroyed, it was only Kayla, my little sister. So it was always just a matter of I'm just there. I'm still just here.
Yeah.
Like I to this day feel like none of my family members really see me. You know what I mean? Like I could change the world tomorrow and they wouldn't see it. And
Yeah.
I feel one of the biggest things that you shared for me was talking about how people at school started treating you differently because you're a father. Um, which reminds me of an instance where when I was going to college, there was a college professor. His name was the judge. I don't remember his full name off the top of my head, but he pulled me aside after class and he asked me if I was related to my mom, like Christina. He's like, "Are you Christina so and so's son?" Um, yeah.
Should have
Why?
said no.
And he's like, "I was one of the sheriffs that worked on the case of her pretending to kidnap herself." And when I tell you that I've never felt so embarrassed and ashamed in my entire life. I can only imagine how you felt with that dwindling friend circle because of who your dad was. So I felt that part so
Yeah.
hard, man, because you feel judged by people that you don't even know. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I can't imagine going through school, especially in today's day and age and how social media is as bad as it is. I can't imagine going to school nowadays and them knowing who your parents are or knowing what your family did. So kudos to you for being who you are right
Yeah.
now, man. I think it takes a really big person to, I mean, we've heard this our entire life, to endure everything that we have. I
Yeah.
think one of the most repeated sentences in my life were from law enforcement when they came over to a domestic issue with my mom, and that was, "You're the most mature adult in the house." And 15, 17 years old, I heard that so many damn times, and it gets exhausting, man. You know how
Yeah.
exhausting it is for people to tell you you're strong and all this stuff. I I just don't
Well,
want.
and you and I have had to play adult as children and age faster, right? Because I was dealing with and I've had people on my show who were basically their parents' interpreters at a young age, and I want to bring up a part of your story that you shared on my show that really resonated with me was when you said, but your mother said, "I hope your brother is more successful in you than everything you do," or something like that, correct? And so, I mean, I've kind of felt that. You said the validation from people we care about. I'll give an example. My show was, I was informed that my show is the number one podcast for suicide prevention awareness on Good Pods as of right now. That may change tomorrow. Who knows?
Hats
But
off to you.
thank you. Yeah. I thought to myself though, you know what I thought? My mom and dad don't even know. And then
Yeah.
they're not even gonna know. And it's like, my dad doesn't even know about any of the stuff I do basically. And it's like he's gonna pass away never knowing that I spoke at these conferences, that I met these people. He sees little clips of it that, these little pictures I send him that don't kind of give stuff away and stuff like that. And it's like my mom, I don't know if she knows. Who know? For all I know, maybe she secretly listens to every episode, but I doubt it. And it's like I'm doing all this stuff, and like my sister actually, ironically enough, reached out to me today. I think my grandmother told her to do it, and asked how I've been, and it was like the list of things I've done since we last spoke, and it's like no one knows. And I posted last night actually on my Instagram. It was late last night. I was like, feel like at the end of the day, it's just me, my dog, and God. And I did a little spiel about how it's interesting DOG and GOD, same three letters and all that. But that's what it feels like most days, because as much as I love all these people I've met through podcasting, through writing and stuff, it's like, yes, I appreciate their support, their encouragement and stuff, but I'll never have that, like parental validation, as you mentioned, that familial acknowledgement from my family members, which just means a lot more. It just naturally does, and it's like, yes, all I care about is this God approving my work, but God doesn't send me a text or a phone call saying good job, son.
All the
It's
stuff
more,
there underneath, right?
it's kind of just there, and it's like, I you know, I mean, I rarely hear my dad. I don't know if you ever hear it either. That I'm proud of you, son, or
Never
you
once.
really turn into a good man, or it's like. It's just and I don't chase after that, but it is just like a permanent hole or wound is how I would describe it. I don't chase after putting a band-aid on it or repairing it. I know that it can't be fixed. All I know is that I can do good work and have an impact regardless of their recognition, but it does sting, and my mom, as I mentioned on our episode together on my show, she told me that I would die alone, that I would never be loved, I would just be a lonely bum full of regrets, that I would be an outcast just as I was my whole life, that I would never write and publish a successful book, that no one would want to hear my story. Like I know a lot of people villainize my dad because he's the addict and domestic violence and sexual abuse. And I understand all of that too. But my mother emotionally and verbally abused us as a result as well. And everything she went through did not necessarily justify it. And I always wanted a relationship with my mom. I always chased after it. And I just got done chasing. I mean, I can't offer anymore. I said, Mom, I will drive up to New Jersey 14 hours and I will spend the day with you if you just take off. Son, I'm too busy. I can't. And then I'm looking at social media and she's at a 7 hour country concert with my sister and half sister the next day. So can you take off work or not? You're in Virginia Beach like for the fifth time this year. Can you take work off? You're at Broadway shows with your new boyfriend, but you can't. If I drove up to New Jersey, you couldn't even see me for a day. We can only chase so much. Relationships, And I did this in my love life a lot too, where I just was a doormat, a giver, 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 always chasing. And friends would stop me and say, Mr. Whiskey, relationships are two ways. They cannot be one way. Okay, that's called unrequited. It's called unreceived, you know. And I had that with my mother, you know, and I had it with the women I pursued, you know, and there's a lot of studies about that. So thanks, Mom. You know, I'm not gonna blame all my bad relationships on her.
Right.
Um, I used to I really end up always attracting pagan women and who ruined my life, but you know, a lot of it though mirrored the relationship I had with my mother, which was just unrequited, constantly giving up everything and pursuing a woman who just wasn't interested in me to the full degree that they expressed.
Yeah. There is something that I wanted to bring up because you've mentioned it a lot, and I think it's not talked about nearly enough. It's people are so quick to say, toxic and absent fathers, right? But how often do we hear the conversation of toxic and absent mothers? Practically
Yeah.
never. And I don't even mean to be it, a sex thing or gender thing, whatever. It's man, woman, whoever, toxic is toxic. But we're in a society where it's so easy, like you said, to blame the addict, to blame the person who has had a past, but ignore everything that the other side is doing, right? And I feel like for the longest time, there were so many of my family members that would stick up for my mom. Be like, oh, well, she had a rough childhood. Okay, she's 50 years old. How long are we going to hold on to the childhood before she does something?
Yeah.
And I feel when I first started telling my story and started talking about my mom, people were all in like shock and everything. Oh, I thought it would be your dad that would have ruined your life or something like that. And so many people in society, for some reason, are so quick to point the
Yes.
fingers at the fathers. Granted, there are a lot of toxic and absent fathers.
The maternal
But
instinct doesn't just like give you a right to do whatever or to be forgiven for everything. Just like my father's addiction doesn't give him the right to be forgiven for everything. Here's what I'll say, Chris, to your point, because I'm really glad you brought this up. This is not talked about enough. I only really know about this because of single fathers I've worked with. If you go to court and you have a case of trying to take a child away from an addicted mother, it's still going to be a rough case.
yep,
Heaven forbid the father drinks or does drugs, child's gone. Child is gone. But I've had single fathers who were good guys trying to get their child away from a mother who was abusive and addictive. And it was like, you can't take the kid from the mother. I mean, that's her kid. It's our kid, and she's a danger. And they had to fight, and most of them lost.
yep,
Just for the fact that the mother was the mother, had birthed the child.
yep,
And I mean, credit to women for giving birth. You know, I don't do it. I haven't done it. But just because you give birth to someone doesn't mean you know how to treat them or raise them right. All right. You know, birth isn't an automatic manual, right? They talk about the maternal instinct. It's like if the maternal instinct was truly for everyone and powerful, we wouldn't have abusive mothers at all, right? But there are mothers who physically beat their children, who sexually abuse them, who verbally and emotionally abuse them, who hate their children, who don't talk to their children. Like this maternal instinct, I don't know. I think animals have it better than human women do sometimes. Like, there, don't get me wrong. There are mothers who they found out they were pregnant, quit smoking that day.
yep,
And I have so much respect for those women. You know, we've seen mothers who run into burning buildings to save their children, right? There are plenty of good moms out there. But that's
absolutely.
not what the conversation is on right now. It's about highlighting too, there are bad mothers and this idea of, well, they're the mother of the child, therefore they're always going to protect the child or know what's best for the child, even if they're addicted, even if they're abusive. That's just not true. And the fact that it's basically an unspoken rule of court and this culture that we have created is so wrong. And you know, there are so many single fathers being wronged, and the children, and at the end of the day, the children are the ones who pay for it. The court looks at it and says, "Oh, the mother will be so upset and suffer because their child is taken away." What about the child who you just put back into an abusive home or with an addicted mother? Let's look at the child. That's what this is about. It's not about the parents. At the end of the day, it's supposed to be about what is best for the child. And sometimes being away from the mother is what's best, not this
Mhm.
pre-developed construct of, well, children who are away from their mother suffer. No, there are certain, I've met plenty of kids who wish they had been taken away from their mothers in their youth. It would have been better for them.
My aunt almost adopted me when all the shit was going down with my dad and mom. And when my mom gave me away for 3 months after my first attempt, I didn't get a call from her. She didn't check to see how I was
Yeah.
doing, nothing. And she still had custody of us. And in Florida, and you said you're in Georgia, right?
Yes.
In Florida, it's a mom heavy state. So it's very hard for single fathers to get full custody of their kids, even partial custody. Heaven forbid the guy has a speeding ticket and oh my God, he has a speeding ticket. We're not going to give him custody. And I know for my listeners that might sound a little extreme, but that's the truth of the matter. I have been on the child side of custody battles, and it is not a good time. I'm unfortunately old enough to remember the tug of war that my parents went through growing up. And um,
It's
yeah,
a
man,
double standard. It should be
it
the
really
same all
is.
across the board. It's like it shouldn't matter mother, father, they need to be held to the same standard. So if both, can't have this type of ticket or this type of history, then both of them can't. If both of them can, then both of them can.
Absolutely, man. Um, so I wanted to ask how you came up with the name of your podcast. How did you come to the name of CoupleoNukes?
For sure. And I do have to real quick just say it's the same in the military. I witnessed where it was if you were a single mother and you said, I have to come into work late and leave early to get my kid to and from daycare, approved. Boom. My friend, former friend, he was a single father. And, he said the same exact thing to Senior Chief. This was Senior Chief's reply to him. Well, I'm your daddy now. That was his reply to, hey, I need to come in a little late and leave a little early to get my kid to and from daycare. I'm a single father. Well, I'm your daddy now and you're my kid. What? But the mother, go ahead. You know what? If you need to take off whole days, go ahead. And getting parental plans approved as a father, at least on my ship in certain chains of command that I saw, it was biased towards women. So I just want to put that out there too. Even the military was kind of the same
Right,
way. And the idea of, oh, well, you're men, you're soldiers and sailors, you need to be able to handle and juggle all this. Well, these women in the military, they're soldiers and sailors just as much. Don't genderize them. They should be held to the same physical fitness standards, the same emotional standards, and the same resilience and the same parental standards, right? We are soldiers and sailors. We kind of had to drop the gender from it because we need to be ready, you
right,
know? If I need the women to be just as strong. So if they're the only ones around and I'm trapped under debris, any sailor or soldier should be able to get me regardless of gender. Not, hold on, let me go get a man. What?
right,
We're
right.
we're under attack right now. So
Mhm.
that's just my little bit on that. But as far as the name of my show, I was a nuclear operator in the United States Navy, electrician's mate specifically, and we're all called nukes. They call us nukes, and we have a term nuking it out, which refers to nuclear operators in the Navy who are overthinking, arguing technical details, lacking common sense. We were notorious for nuking it out. And so one day we were sitting around a couple of nukes, so there's the beginning of it. And we were having a conversation, and I was like, these nuclear operators are like 1% of 1% of 5%. Like these are the strangest, smartest people in the world. You know, at least that's what they told us. I hope it's true. And the more smart you are, the more strange you are. That's just how it kind of works. You look at the eccentric minds of history, and even today, I won't name any names, but there are some smart people who are pretty strange, right? And we all probably know someone at least. And
Absolutely.
so our conversations were reflective of that. I was like, this would make such a unique niche podcast. All right. That was my original plan. By nuclear operators, for nuclear operators, highlighting the mental health crisis of the nuclear community, the suicides, the stress, the burnout, hilarious conversations and just some strange conversations and sometimes just scientific theories applied to normal day stuff that just would blow your mind. um, I jokingly call the show just a nuke because it's just me. I did me a nuclear operator the other day, so that was cool, but it's just me. No other nuclear operators were in on it. They couldn't see the big picture, the dream, which I mean things haven't even played out at all. That's what I dreamed or hoped, right? I mean, the show has just taken a whole different direction. But the idea was a couple of nukes, every episode, a couple of us. Maybe it was just two of us, maybe sometimes five of us having these conversations, creating a great show that just people found so unique. And, obviously every day I wake up and realize that, no one believed in that dream. And, I kind of pivoted. Now, I could have chased after it, but, people just didn't see it. And so when I got out of the military, especially the nuclear community ties were cut off, and I was never really a nuke per se. There's a spectrum of nukeness, believe it or not. And I was never far in on the far end of being a nuke, but to a degree I am. And so when I lost ties to that community, there was like traces of it online, and maybe I could have hunted down and found a couple of nukes to host a show with me. But I figured once my friends got out, eventually, that we would all do it together. And so in the meantime, I started doing military mental health. But what that did was people start calling me, Mr. Military Man. It was just military this, veteran that, military mental health this and that, which is important. I've been recognized for my work in military mental health, but I didn't want to just be a military man. I didn't want my identity to be not liking the military. It's a big part of my identity. But that was all I was. Anywhere I went, it was like, here's Mr. Whiskey, by a veteran for veterans and active duty. And it was like, no, the show is supposed to help more people. It's military members, but the advice is applicable to more than just them. And so that was when I branched out into civilian guests as well, and just being a show where not every episode is for everyone, but everyone has an episode for them. And, you can always take away something from every episode if you wanted. But the idea was people kept trying to niche me down and box me down. And that was never who I wanted to be or what I wanted to be. I wanted a platform similar to yours where it's a variety of diverse guests with different stories, different recovery techniques from, and my show goes into a lot more niche stuff sometimes, but, all over just self-improvement, And so that's where it kind of came down to. And I do perform poorly as far as like the algorithm in terms of like, yes, if you look at my show, you'll find all my stuff right away because there's no other show that's called CoupleoNukes.
Right.
But people don't find it as naturally as well because of the name of it. But I had
Hmm.
decided to stick with it. I believe God can defy any algorithm, and that Couple of Nukes pays homage to the origins is very important to my story for a lot of reasons. And so I've thought about renaming the show. Trust me, I've generated a lot of different titles, but I'm sticking with it. Am
Yeah.
I accidentally high up in the charts on couples podcasts? I am. It's just because every episode has the word couple in it.
Right. Right.
Um, do I do a lot of relationship stuff? Not as much, but it's been a battle with the algorithms, with the name, with the SEO. But the show itself speaks to the people who does find it, and I found it to be very fruitful and productive. And again, you and I have discussed it's not for the millions of people, right, who don't take anything away. It's for the
Right.
small handful who do take something away.
And I remember when I first started the podcast and didn't really have a set direction, I guess. And when I started figuring out my groove and getting guests on and everything and having people tell their story, the name of the podcast that I chose made a lot more sense. I'm like, oh, okay, this makes a lot more sense instead of just sharing my perspective on the subjects like I was originally. I had guests on talking about their story, including yourself, and I remember being so hyper focused on those numbers, man. It was so bad. I was in therapy just saying nobody's listening, and I just feel like a failure, even though some of these episodes are brilliant and recorded with people around the world. And you get in your head a lot, and then you get that clarity from people like yourself who remind me why I do this. It's not for those millions of people. We're not on that level that Joe Rogan is going to be on, not to name drop him, but you know he is at the top of the podcasting world.
But people
And
don't realize, or ourselves included, those big shows are 0.001% of all podcasts. people have it so skewed. And I don't know if you keep up with the statistics and reports. I look at them every day because I am a bit of a numbers guy. 578 podcasters quit on average daily. 578. So, and I think I may have mentioned this to you or someone else, but Chris, just you coming back from your break, let's say you were gone for about a month, times 578 a day, and here you are recording again. I mean, like my show is in the top 2% of all global shows. And it's not because I have the biggest show. It's just because of the sheer fact that so many people quit. Only about where I'm at now, over 200 episodes, I've recorded over 300 episodes. Only about 3% of people make it that far because of the demand, the consistency, the work, right? So, Chris, I will say to the point of the numbers don't reflect, like the public numbers don't reflect the private numbers, right? People will look at views on Instagram, on YouTube, on you check your own downloads on Buzzsprout or Apple Podcasts or whatever it may be, Spotify. But those don't reflect the numbers that people don't see, those private industry reports, which people can find. Go to buzzsprout.com/stats or Alex Sanfilippo puts out the independent podcasters report once a month. If people actually knew those numbers, they would realize, like I just read about the financial report. Again, that 0.001% of like all the podcasters make almost 75% or more of the income, the total income. So you think about that 0.001% are making almost all of the money of the entire podcasting industry, millions
Right.
of dollars, all just by 0.001%, not 1%, 0.001%. Now, don't get me wrong. I check my download numbers every 15 minutes because I have an app on my phone and I just refresh it. But I've learned by it's all about perspective. Statistics. I posted today about men's sexual assault violence statistics, how it went from 1 in 17 to 1 in 4 because they changed the way the numbers were interpreted. So downloads are the same as any statistics. People say, well, numbers don't lie. Statistics are honest. No, they can be biased, misrepresented, and out of context, read in very different ways. And so to your point of I've been there myself where I'm looking at the numbers, it's like, man, this trust me, it's never the episodes that you think are gonna be amazing that blow up. There'll be some random one that you did and you're like, people like this? But the other one, I made the special title and I did special stuff and I really, really planned it out.
You
And
know what
then
the
this
worst part of that is? When you get those emails from those the scammers saying, "Oh, well, your YouTube channel doesn't look perfect. I can help you do
oh, I
this."
get those. I get five of those a day and it's the same exact picture and everything. And it's like,
It's
thank
like,
goodness
brother,
for AI, because it's like funny because this AI did an analysis against your SEO ranking versus my SEO ranking. Like, I don't email them back. I get, that's part of the podcast. And I get five a day. I stopped taking friend requests on LinkedIn because it was just Apple podcast promoters. And there's a trend. I won't say anything here, but they always have the same type of name and profile picture. It's
yep,
always the same people.
every single time.
Um, and it's like for beginner podcasters, I'll say, don't let these scam emails get into your head because that's what they try to do. They try to make you feel insignificant. They try to like damage you. Here's the thing, and I don't know if Chris, if you and I had talked about, I've talked about it a lot on my show, which is the social media competing in a world of
It's
that indulges in sexual violence, racism, gore, memes, right? Making a genuine, you and I both make social media clips, and it's like competing. I can't even go on social media anymore because like I was on there today and I saw some frogs having a tea party. That someone set up a little fake tea party with frogs. Over 5,000 likes in like the first, 10 minutes. I saw a guy who was touching an anthill and it had 1.2 million likes. And it's like we just somehow
what are
don't
we doing?
and can't compete against it. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's like if you try to do that, if you try to touch an anthill and be like, by the way, I have a podcast,
right.
negative 1.2 million likes.
Crazy.
So
The simplest things get the most likes, and I've noticed it over the last 2 years, especially with TikTok being a thing, and some of the videos and stuff you come across on there. I keep myself away from TikTok because it's just awful there. Um, but it amazes me some of the people get as much attention as they do because like it
yeah.
can be the most vile take you've ever heard in your life. Over 3 million likes. It's like, bro, what?
And I never realized it until I was creator because, before I was a creator, I was on social media a little bit and it's like I just liked stuff. It was fine. Now I'm like like it's just frustrating to see these numbers. And I know not to compare. My point being was I was getting to you'll always get hate from people below you. It's
Yep.
never like successful podcasts. You're like, oh, Chris, your numbers really suck, man. They'll be like,
Right.
Chris, I've been there, dude, and like where you're at. Sometimes they'll be like, you're off better to the start than I was when I began. It like the people who are successful are usually supportive because they understand. It's these people who have no idea what they're talking about, who have an anime girl profile picture and some random name that has some kind of sex joke in it that are gonna be dropping the hate comments and I hate YouTube Shorts because it has a dislike button
Mhm.
because I'll see content that gets disliked and it's like what please I'd love for the person to actually genuinely tell me what was wrong with this clip. Like, you know, one of my
You know
most
what I chalk it
disliked
down to,
clips.
man? I
Yeah.
always chalk it down to no accountability on that person that puts dislikes on something. Like, I can understand if the guest might be controversial or if the take is
Yeah.
controversial, but I feel like the wholesome things that I see that get disliked, it's usually from people that cannot hold themselves accountable for anything.
100% because my most disliked video was positive versus negative de-stressors. And I talked about the negative effects of just coping with copious amounts of sex, weed, and alcohol as negative de-stressor and the balance that I needed to have. Dislike, 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 dislike. And I said, I guarantee you, drinkers, weed smokers, and sex people, that's where those dislikes are generating in from. But it's like if I post a clip about here's a great piece of advice on stopping a suicide from a guest who's like a suicide expert who's dealt with it, who's been suicidal, who's dealt with it. What are you disliking? What are you disliking about it? Did you disagree? No, you just didn't like, it's like that's why I do hate YouTube Shorts for the dislike buttons. At least on like Instagram, I assume I don't use TikTok, but I assume TikTok, there's no dislike button. I couldn't imagine what the world would turn to if there was a dislike on Instagram, and
It would be obnoxious, that's for sure.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
One of the last questions I wanted to ask you on here. What do you think young adults need most when it comes to mental health support, and what are they not getting? We talk
Hmm.
about the power of social media, right? We talk about all the resources and things. What do you feel is the biggest thing that the younger generation is missing?
What I've seen in my personal experience with mental health care is a lack of personal connection, especially military side, civilian side. And I was just on an episode for Suicide Prevention Month coming up here talking about so many people just nowadays throw people to resources. It's just become here's 988 hotline, here's the textbook, here's this and that. They've taken away that I really like the military did put forward an acronym I like ask, care, treat. So many people just treat. All right, here's the resources. They just throw you to someone else. But so many people are looking for that. No, I don't want to know that someone behind a hotline whose job it is to say they care. Maybe they do genuinely care, but I want to know, do the people around me care? Right?
You
So if
know,
someone comes to you who is suicidal and they're sharing that with you, they want to know that you care, not that you know what resources are available. Like give them those resources afterward, but make that personal connection.
yeah.
Ask and care first before you treat. And I think that's what's missing. I think so many young adults are so buried into the 988 hotline and all these resources put out by shows. Like I still put those out. I still provide those because it's
Mhm.
important and it works for the people who it works for. There are a lot of people who need that personal connection. And so yes, social media is a trove of resources for suicide prevention and awareness, but it's also created a lack of personal accountability, a lack of it's created a just pass them off, pass them off, pass them off. That's not what we need. Don't pass me off to a therapist. I'm asking you, you're my friend. I want to talk to you right now. You're my family member. I want to talk to you right now. Why are you telling me to go talk to a therapist? I want to talk to you first. If I wanted to talk to a therapist, I would have gone and talked to one, right? So I think it's become a very pass off generation. It's like, yes, our generation has more mental health resources and more conversations about it than ever before, but it's created this bystander mentality, this ability to pass off instead of take personal action. And I know that's a
Look at how many.
controversial take, but that's what I,
No,
you know,
I
I
agree.
feel.
You look at every video you see on social media, whether it's somebody getting beat up, somebody getting dragged across the street. What are people doing?
They're recording it.
recording,
Yeah.
right? And when I was on the text hotline, it's a suicide hotline, but it was through text. We couldn't be personal with the people, and I get it because it's very sensitive information, and there's a lot of things that you could trigger and set off if you try to make it personal, right? Um, the biggest thing I struggled with was not being personal with those people because be like, I understand. I know what you're going through. You can't say any of that. It has to be a robotic response. You have to get their name. You have to build rapport and you have to
I
add
know, but
all.
I rather hear, "Hey, I'm Chris, and I've been suicidal twice. I almost jumped off my high school
Yeah.
roof." That speaks to me.
Yeah. And, I remember talking to one of the counselors, like manager or whatever you want to call him. And I said to him, I really struggle with this because I want to be personal with these people. And I've had somebody say, this sounds like a robot. You sound like you're a robot. And I told him, I said, unfortunately, I can't say anything more than this. And I was 100% upfront with him. I can help you the way I can help you on here, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not like listening. I would rather call the hotline than use the text line personally because you're talking to someone.
100%. Yeah.
Now, granted, they are more or less the same exact way they have to respond to you, but at least you're talking to somebody on the phone. Um, I completely agree with the bystander take. I think this generation has the AI thing has taken over in like the most unhealthy way, in my opinion. Like you said, the memes are really bad. I mean, we all make memes, we all laugh at things, whatever. But I feel it gets to a point where it's like, okay, are we going to actually take stuff seriously, or are we just going to make a joke out of everything?
And we don't even value human life the same way anymore.
Right. Right. And I think the best example of that is the CEO for what was it, Blue Cross Blue Shield that was terminated a couple months ago. And regardless of my opinion about the guy, I don't agree with how the public treated that whole situation. It was just like, oh well, good, he's gone. What? Well, you don't know this man.
Right? The impact of what happens when you idolize death
Yeah,
as the means of action necessary to create change. It was the same idea, that creates a huge impact that, okay, so basically you want to tear down human, the whole system we have set up. And I'm not saying the system is right or works well, but the whole idea is that it protects lives and that we are civilized human beings.
yeah,
Because if this spreads and okay, now violence and action is next thing you know, you're gonna have the purge movies, or we're gonna end up like war-torn countries across the globe, you know?
right. And it's tough, man. So I ask all of my guests this before we get to our closing words. If you could change one thing in the mental health community, what would it be?
Well, they caught me off guard with that one because there's a lot of things I'd like to say, and I'm trying to think broader because a lot of my focus goes to the military mental health community, but I think it is reflective in the civilian world as well. My biggest thing that I always talk about for the military as well as for young adults is part of the mental health crisis is the lack of parental guidance, mentorship, especially now, I can't even speak on the younger generations having a tablet from birth. I didn't have social media when I was in high school. I wasn't allowed to, right? And that was the very beginning of like Instagram and Snapchat, that it wasn't like to the extent it is now. Not at all. This was when memes were like a stock image pasted onto another stock image,
Right.
this was like that era. And so like I think though a lot of people are growing up being raised. If I could change one thing, actually, it would be that the fact that we live in a day and age of celebrities. Celebrities, influencers, and politicians are what raise us. It's not parents, it's not mentors, it is idolization and popularity. And if I could put forward good values over that stuff, if I could say, hey, forget all the money going into the entertainment industry. Let's put it into first responders, into the military, into nurses, into people who work 12-hour shifts, not movie stars and celebrities and singers. Look, there's a time and place for entertainment, but it's become such a priority that I think it ripples down into mental health. To bring it back to mental health, we're putting all of our time and energy into stuff that is negative for our mental health. All right. I don't Sure, there are good movies that show a positive impact about mental health, right? But they're far and few in between. This world is built on celebrities, idolization, and escapism. That's what it is. And if honestly, if I could change one thing about the world, it would be, that this will sound very crusader of me, but I would have everyone read the Bible beginning to end once in their life. So many people who aren't of faith have never ever read the Bible. And even if you don't come out a believer, there are a lot of reflection points on life and on mental health and on parenting and all stuff that are good moral stuff, right? I mean, most of our laws are built on the foundation of Christianity's morals, right? And I'm not saying that we need to force God on everyone, but I think there's a lot of stuff that if we lived the way the Bible was, we wouldn't have a mental health crisis. We wouldn't have so much, we wouldn't be in a fallen world to the degree that we are. And so I
Agreed.
think proper mentorship, having not Hollyweird, not the celebrities, not influencers raise our children, but us in grounded works that are good and wholesome, like the Bible, or like being active parents who are putting forward good values and, not making everything this popularity competition, not making it all about sex and drugs and money, putting forward stuff that when people pursue it, their mental health will be intact or better than
Yeah.
what the world is telling them to pursue.
Right.
Hopefully
Yeah.
that makes sense.
I completely agree. I miss the day of heroes, man. I miss growing up and saying, "Oh yeah, I want to be a firefighter. I want to be this." Now it's I want to be a streamer. I want to I want to have my own
I want
makeup
to be a
line.
gangster.
Yeah, it's a really weird generation because I don't know how to connect to that age group anymore because it's like you said, tablet from birth, and I see kids in the mall or kids at restaurants and they're just glued to their
Speaking their
phones.
own language, the
Yeah,
skibbity toilet riz and all the brain rot
yeah,
stuff. They're making up their own language.
right. It's crazy, and I just my brain can't process like how they think and how they go through life because it's like we are part of that generation of in my opinion, I think we're the last good generation. I mean, I'm not saying other generations are shit, but I think generations that followed millennials, I think are just they don't get it. They just something isn't clicking, and I don't know what it's gonna take for them to turn that switch on. But until they get rid of this, until they get rid of cell phones and tablets from their face, they're never gonna see the world that's in front of them and what's actually going on.
I don't necessarily blame them because they're being born into a world of
Yeah,
indoctrination. So
right.
to a degree, I almost feel pity for all these generations, and they're
Mhm.
gonna be like, "You look down on us." Well, it's like I feel bad because you're being born into a world where if you're a young man and you go on social media, the algorithm is automatically showing you sexualized women.
Yep.
I don't know what it shows women because I've never been a young woman on social media, but like it's pre-programmed,
Yeah.
it is. So
Yeah. I completely agree, man. Before we get to our closing words and closing quote of the podcast, where can our listeners find you on social media?
for sure. So couple O nukes, that's nukes Nukes. And if you look that up on the internet or Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, couple of nukes and Mr. Whiskey, my stuff usually almost always pops up. I really put forward coupleonukes.com that has all my episodes categorized. So if you want to focus on suicide prevention, you can do that. If you want to focus on women's health, you can do that. If you want to focus on career, fitness, finance, whatever it is, they are categorized for your, convenience. I've got all my guests who have ever been on the show and all their resources cataloged as well into their own sections. So if you want to talk to just Vietnam veterans, if you want to look at people who are relationship coaches, they're all categorized as well. Has all my contact information, so my email, my social medias, every show I've been on, a ton of great resources as well, from pregnancy support to just stuff for addiction. And so coupleonukes.com, kind of the main resource hub for everything you would need regarding me. And like I said, even if you don't listen to my show, there are a lot of resources on there that can be used to help improve your life from people around the globe. Experts and people way more qualified than me in certain niches for sure.
Perfect, man. I appreciate you. So I usually like to end our podcast with a closing quote based on the subject, and found a really good one. But before I read mine, do you have any closing words for our listeners?
Not necessarily. What I would say is, I think creativity, I do want to focus on creativity as much as we've spoken about the creator life. That is what kept me sane. You asked earlier on about coping mechanisms, and it was pouring my heart into creativity. And it was fictional stuff at first. And one day I will return to my first true love, so to speak, which is fiction writing. But later on in life, I poured that creativity into helping others and making an impact. And my biggest message would just be, you know, using what you've been through to help others. That's what you and I both do on a daily basis. And I think it's so important. And so for people who feel like they've had to deal with this mental health crisis head on, that if you related to the parental favoritism, to the poor parenting, to the sibling rivalries, whatever it may be, leverage it to create something good. Maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's a book, maybe it's just a Facebook post, or maybe it's just a conversation with someone you met. You know, we can't change what happened, but we can leverage it to the best of our abilities to use it to create opportunities to build community and to connect with one another. So I think that's so important. Don't just give up and wallow in self-pity or victimization. And if you're in a bad situation, you know, make the most of it. That's all we can really do, and it's the best thing we can do, in my opinion.
I completely agree, man. I think, like you said, all it takes is that one conversation, and that's all it took for me. It took one Facebook post, and here I am telling my story. Here you are telling your story. So, I appreciate you for sharing that. And let me close out with my quote, and this is from Danielle. I think you say her last name is Cope K. I don't. I'm gonna butcher that. I apologize. You don't ever have to feel guilty about removing toxic people from your life. Doesn't matter whether someone is a relative, romantic interest, employer, childhood friend, or a new acquaintance. You don't have to make room for people who cause you pain or make you feel small. It's one thing if a person owns up to their behavior and makes an effort to change, but if a person disregards your feelings, ignores your boundaries, and continues to treat you in a harmful way, they need to go.
Yeah. And I would just, to add on to that, they're gonna guilt you. They're gonna say, but I'm your dad, but I'm your mom, but we're blood, we're family, or, we've been together all these years. Whatever they will do, especially if they're a toxic, narcissistic person who's manipulative, they will guilt you, they will bribe you, they will blackmail you. Don't allow that to overcome what you're trying to do, which is remove those negative people from your life. And trust me, I've been on the receiving end of the guilt trip many, many times, and it's rough. It is rough, especially when it comes to family more than anything. But, on the other side, it will benefit not just you, but everyone in your life when you remove that toxic person. You got to think it's not just about you, it's about your future children, your future spouse, your future friends and communities. They're all waiting on you to remove that toxic person too. And the amount of people I know apology to, my friends who have stayed with me as I endured toxic relationships, and they said, you need to get rid of her. And I said, no, you don't understand the amount of bridges I have burnt choosing that toxic person over, I owe a lot of apologies. So, don't, you don't want to have to owe all those apologies. Put yourself first and we, like I said, serve others, but take care of yourself first too.
Thank you, man. Mr. Whiskey, I appreciate you sharing your story with us. Hopefully, somewhere down the line, we can get a part two and cover a bit more
Of
of your
course.
story.
Yeah,
Until then, thank you so much for coming on and telling your story. And for all my listeners, as always, thank you for listening. And as always, be gentle with yourselves. Till next time, much love, guys.